But what we're going to see today is a shift in the story. As we've seen time and time again, there's all sorts of characteristics of great leadership, and we're going to see that play out again this morning. Well, and the other thing we're going to see this morning in the latter part of Nehemiah 7 is just how big the wall was. We tend to think that it really wasn't that big, but the wall was completed in 52 days. Well, I'll just let the cat out of the bag. We're going to see in the end of chapter 7 that there was 46, close to 47,000 people living within Jerusalem. So it wasn't a wall like around this property. It was a pretty sizable wall, and they finally have come to the completion of the wall. Now, one of the things I want us to remember is what Nehemiah's goal was in the first place, because it's going to show up in our characteristics of great leadership. His goal was not to rebuild the wall. And it's easy for us to look at the book of Nehemiah and think that it's just a great book on seeing God's wall built in 52 days from the rubble that was there. Nehemiah's goal was to restore God's people for God's glory, and the rebuilding of the wall was one phase of that, one big phase of that. And so you can say this. In the first half of the book of Nehemiah, the people existed for the wall, but from this point forward, the wall existed for the people, right? So the people had to build the wall, and now Nehemiah has put the gates into the wall, and we're going to see his leadership shift from the task of rebuilding the wall to putting leaders in place and how he chose leaders. I think you would agree with me, the city is much more than its walls and its gates, and very much like the church, a city is the people. It's not the place. And so as we look at this, I want you to think on two different levels. On the first hand, I want you to think about yourself individually. On the second, I want you to think of us as a church as we continue to move forward into the future and how these things apply to us. And there's just some amazing things in here this morning. I'm going to skip that and let's go on to the first thing that we see in a great leader. We see this in Nehemiah, that he enlisted trustworthy support. Now, we're going to see this unfold here in the first few verses. But like any good leader, Nehemiah knew that he could not get the job done by himself, and so he began to put trustworthy leaders in place over key areas to organize things inside the walls of Jerusalem. And so here's a pretty obvious statement, but I believe you would agree with me that what's the point of a wall if it doesn't increase the quality of life? You can build this great big wall, but if it's just a wall and it doesn't help with anything, then what's the purpose of the wall in the first place? And so what we're going to see today as we look at the parallels between this physical wall and the spiritual wall that God is calling us to build as a church for the protection, the provision, and the safety of God's people. And so as he was enlisting some very trustworthy the help, the first that we see comes to, he gathered 2 assistants. So Nehemiah, he knew he was going to need leaders full of excellence. Now, why is that so important? Well, let's not forget that just a few verses ago, we realized that particularly in the tribe of Judah, they had intermarried. So what group comes out of the tribe of Judah? You can speak and search this morning. What leadership comes out of the tribe of Judah? All right, we will read on and we'll see if you can discover that answer. But they had intermarried. Remember that one of their enemies, Tobiah, had inside evidence because of the intermarrying from this tribe. And so let's jump to verse 1 and 2 of Nehemiah chapter 7. After the wall had been rebuilt, I had set the doors in place. The gatekeepers and the singers and the Levites were appointed. I put in charge of Jerusalem my brother Hanani, along with Hananiah, the commander of the citadel. So he's choosing these two men, and we're going to see some of the qualities and characteristics that were evident in these men in the second half of verse 2, which says this: because he was a man of integrity and feared God more than most men do. I want that to sink in for a sec. He chose them not because it was his brother and this Hananiah was the commander of the citadel. He chose them because they were men of integrity and feared God more than most men do. Now, if you have a different version, you'll see that the word integrity is usually trustworthy or faithful. But I want you to think about this for a moment. The word integrity, this Hebrew word for integrity, that means a firmness, trustworthiness, consistency, duration, faithfulness, and truth. When you think about integrity, the integrity of something, another definition of integrity is that it is the same all the way through, right? So my dad has got this gift of picking the sweetest watermelon out there. And if you saw him choosing a watermelon, you might think the guy's got a few screws loose, which wouldn't be too far off, and the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree either. But he'll sit there and he'll thump on the watermelon. And he can tell by the sound of the watermelon how ripe that watermelon is. And has he ever brought a watermelon home that wasn't like perfectly ripe? No. Right? And so the idea here, when you think of a perfect watermelon, the integrity of it, it's the same all the way through. And he can tell that just by thumping on the watermelon. You know, when something lacks integrity, it would be like the inside of that watermelon being rotten on the inside. And if you tapped it and you've heard enough watermelon that are full of integrity, then you can tell the difference. And so when he comes to these two men, there's this firmness. They are the same all the way through. You know, they fear God more than most. Does that mean they're afraid of God? Well, to some degree, they're in such awe of who God is that there's this respectful fear of who God is. They're not scared into not doing anything, but because they understand who God is, then they're doing things for God's glory. They're trustworthy, they're consistent all throughout, you know, their time in the good and the bad. And so these are the qualities and characteristics Nehemiah was looking for, these two key leaders that he'd put in positions for the city of Jerusalem to move forward. But I want you to keep that in mind, integrity and the fear of God as we move forward. Now here's the interesting thing. Because Judah had intermarried, even the priests and prophets were compromised. It was absolutely important that Nehemiah chose wisely of the leaders that he would put into place, or else everything that they had labored for would be of no use. 52 days they rebuilt this wall that housed, I think, 46,000, just under 47,000 people in 52 days. I believe that would be a feat that would be difficult to accomplish today, even with heavy machinery. And remember, he did it with people that were unschooled, untrained in some of these things. And so now he's choosing wisely to put people in place in key positions so that all of this can be used in the right way, and that we're not putting people in positions, for example, a gatekeeper who's not going to keep the gate locked. What good is the wall if somebody can get in? But here's a question I want you to think about in your life. Who do you have in your life who's full of integrity and the fear of God, that's helping you become more godlike? That's helping you understand what integrity looks like. That's helping you understand what the fear of God looks like. And it's helping you live in such a way. And so the second thing that Nehemiah then goes on to is the gatekeepers. So he enlists these two men, his brother and the commander of the citadel. And, now they look at who the gatekeepers are, because, again, what good is a gate if there's no one to close it? Now remember, they had to rebuild the gates totally because they had been totally burnt down, and so they built these gates. Was the last thing that they did. Now here's an interesting thing that you may not know. You guys are all familiar with the Great Wall of China, right? It is a great wall. You can see it from outer space. It is so wide that you can drive multiple vehicles on top of it. But 4 times throughout history, the wall did no good in keeping the enemy out. You know how the enemy got in? They bribed the gatekeeper. And the gatekeeper left it open. The enemy came in and was victorious. And so it's very important in our lives that we make sure that we have a gatekeeper. Adrian Rogers said this, so it is in our lives, the gatekeeper of our heart must be faithful, or the walls of restraints, the laws of God's word, will do us no good. Just think about yourself. Think about your family. Think about this church. When it comes to the gatekeepers, remember the gates were there not to keep people from going in and out, but the gates were there so that the people had a place of refuge. The gates were there to keep certain people out. As we're going to see in a moment, one of Nehemiah's aspects of leadership was to determine who belonged inside the gates. But we need to think about this concept of gatekeepers. Now, even in our own lives, right? And we live in a society today that, I feel sorry for the younger generation because you guys have been so bombarded with things that we didn't have to deal with on a daily basis as we all do now, when we were growing up. The stuff that is at the accesses our fingertips and the way we can communicate and all the information that is available, you guys are bombarded with all the time where we weren't, growing up. And so here's the challenge with this world of information and the temptations that are everywhere we look, that once that gate either doesn't get closed all the way or the lock is lost, the opportunity for the enemy to come in increases dramatically. And much like the Great Walls of China, the wall itself didn't do any good. And so we need to ask, who's guarding the gates in our lives, in our families, or even in the church as we move forward? Let's look at verse 3. I said to them, the gates of Jerusalem are not to be opened until the sun is hot. While the gatekeeper is still on duty, have them shut the doors and bar them. So Nehemiah gave specific reasons or for a specific time that the gates were not to be opened yet. Now, we could get into the significance of this statement, but we don't have time this morning, but I'll let you go and do some study on that. Why did he wait till it was hot? And then, obviously, we understand that shut and lock and bar the doors while you're still on duty. So he enlisted these assistants, he listed the gatekeepers, and now he goes on to the guards. Now it's interesting here when we talk about guards that there are 2 different types of guards that Nehemiah was choosing. One was those who would they have a specific watch, a specific, we would call it for police officers, a beat that was their spot to be able to pay attention to and to protect. On the other hand, there were like what we would call neighborhood watches. Now, you remember Nehemiah before when he organized the people to rebuild the wall, he had them do it where they lived. Because there was more skin in the game and there was more that they would want to make sure that wall is of the utmost of integrity because that portion of the wall was going to protect them. So in the same way, he got people to do that. So they were residents of Jerusalem. And some had these areas that they were over, and others were just kind of checking out in front of their houses. Now, it's interesting to me that when you think about, well, I'll just speak for myself, that sometimes I get so busy on the task at hand, and I spend so much time and energy in that task that by the time that task is about wrapped up, I am worn out. Now, let me suggest this. Much as it's easy to look at the book of Nehemiah and to think it's a book about rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, I think sometimes we get so focused on one thing that we miss the big picture. And I would say this, that great leaders see the whole picture, not just the tasks. If the goal of Nehemiah was to rebuild the wall, then when the wall got rebuilt, then he'd be going, well, what do we do now? But see, Nehemiah knew in the whole time when he was coming, it wasn't just about the wall. The wall was part of the process of restoring God's people in Jerusalem, for God's glory. And part of that meant, in order to do so, they needed to be protected. As we'll see in the end of chapter 7, not only did they need to be protected, but they needed to be preserved in the sense of who had the right to be within the walls of Jerusalem. But we need to think about the same things in our lives. Where are the key entry points? Where are the things that we need to guard the most? What is it that we are allowing into our homes, into our lives and different things? We need to make sure there's guards as well. And so as you can hopefully see that throughout this process, it's something each of us individually need to ask. Hey, who do I have that I have asked to be a guard of my life, a guard of my heart, so that I am not allowing things to have influence on it that shouldn't? Who are we, inviting into our lives to help us to keep focused? Now, here's the reality, especially for us as men, we don't like asking for help, right? What do we always get busted for when we're driving? We don't like to ask for directions. I'll find it, right? I don't think that's necessarily a bad trait in the sense that God has created us to be able to get things done, and to have focus. But then that focus oftentimes takes us off of the simplicity of just asking for help. And so in similar ways, especially us as men, we don't like to ask somebody else. We don't like to admit that we're lost and in need of help. And oftentimes the enemy uses our greatest strengths and he turns them into our greatest weaknesses. And so all of us need to ask people, reliable people of integrity, people that are trustworthy, to come in and give them an opportunity to look at our lives and to help us stay on track. Now, the next thing that we'll see, and it's the biggest part of this chapter. So from verse 4 all the way to verse 69, we're seeing where Nehemiah understood the need to establish residency. In other words, who was it that was to be inside these walls? And as we've already said, there was a lot of intermarriage that had taken place, and so there was a lot of spies that were already inside the wall that were giving information to Tobiah, Tobiah, who then would give it to Sanballat, and the enemies knew what was going on the side. So another thing that we need to consider as we look at our hearts, we look at our families, we look at us as a church moving forward, we really need to look at and examine who's supposed to be here. Now, having said that, I want us to be very cautious when it comes to the church aspect, because I think we can take this way out of proportion, but yet at the same time, we really need to ask who is having influence on the church, the direction of the church. Well, the reality is everyone. But the question that you guys really need to be looking for as we move forward as a church, who are the gatekeepers? Who are the assistants that the church has as you look for the next man that God is calling to lead you well into the future? And this transitional process, while seeming very long, is so incredibly important. And if you really think about it, is going through a lot of the same things that Nehemiah did here in verse 7. They ascertained the state of the protection and put things in place to get back to a certain point. If you think about it, we've done a lot of things already, and to find out where you guys are, the history of the church. We dealt with some things that needed to be dealt with, as we have this amazing time that is always reflected by this picture up front, and we've been continuing to move forward. Now it kind of feels like we're slowing down and we're bogging down, and I'll confess, probably my fault that we haven't been communicating well to you. Mission team is actually wrapping up. They're still meeting. They're still doing things, and the leadership team is in place. The leadership team is doing much of what Nehemiah is doing here. And in doing so, because of the attacks on the church and the influence of the outside, we have to be putting stuff in our Constitution and bylaws to protect. In many ways, the Constitution and bylaws are like some of the gates that are protecting the church from all those who want to get out inside and destroy the church. And the unfortunate thing is that takes quite a bit of time to accomplish. So what they are doing, they have been meeting weekly and they have been going through things. And if you've ever had to help with legal documents in a business, or even if you've had your own business and you got to come up with the articles of incorporation and everything, I don't know about you, but that stuff makes me want to. I can only do it for about 10 minutes. No, probably 5. I can do it, but it's not something that's fun, but it's like rebuilding and hanging a gate so it fits perfectly into that opening so that we are safe and secure. And so I want you to continue praying for that leadership team as they're going through this process, because it's a difficult process. But that's not the only thing that they're doing as well. Part of what they're doing is to figure out, okay, what are these leadership positions that we need moving forward? Who are the assistants? Who are the gatekeepers? And what are other positions that we need to have in the church? Not necessarily right at this moment, but hopefully in the future, because they're looking at the big picture. Now, God's gifted people differently. He's gifted some people that are very good with the details. That is not me. But I do have this weird ability to look at the big picture. Now, where sometimes I can then focus too much on one thing and I have to take a step back. But when I take a step back, I can see the big picture and what needs to be done. Where I'm terrible at is the details in getting this stuff done. And as I've told you before, I'm an 80%er. When I get 80% of a project done, I'm ready to move on to the next, because to me it looks, I can't do that. And when I was leading, I made sure that I surrounded myself with people who were detail people, that I surrounded myself with people that didn't think the same way I did, because I knew, as Nehemiah did, that collectively we're going to come up with a better decision than I could ever come up with by myself. And so in a similar way, we need to determine those things, and as Nehemiah is about to do here, and to determine who is allowed inside, who is allowed to influence, and who can be trusted. So in verse 66 through 69, let me read this for you real quick. The whole company numbered, I'm sorry, I increased it by 4,000. 42,360 people. Besides their 7,337 men servants and maid servants, they also had 245 men and women singers. There were 736 horses, 245 mules, 435 camels, 6,720 donkeys. Now think about the size of the wall. This was no small wall. There was quite a few people that were here. And so what Nehemiah ended up having to do, and you see this in the rest of the verses, he literally goes through, and basically people had to give proof that they were Jewish. And he begins to clean house. But then as he does so, I want you to catch this point. After he does all these things and he puts things in place, the protection is there, he puts leadership in place, he puts guards in place, he puts gatekeepers in place, that he finally gets to a point, as we'll see in the chapters to come, that there's this opportunity for encouraging worship. Now think about this. Up to this time, how much were the people of Israel or the people of Jerusalem able to really worship God when all these other pressures are coming from the outside? Probably not much at all. And the same is true for us when we have all this other stuff bombarding us. And when we tend to focus so much on this problem that we forget the big picture, oftentimes it's hard to worship. I was talking with our worship team a week and a half ago, And as we were talking, the idea was, what is worship? And we tend to think worship is music and different things. That's just a sliver of helping us to worship through music and song and different things. But it's an attitude of worship that we come together to have times of praise, which I'll tell you what, on Wednesday nights, you just got to come to a Wednesday night now. I know we've been saying that for a long time, but Wednesday nights have shifted when we start with these words of encouragement. And I'll tell you what, probably at least a third of our time is taken up in these times of praise of what God has been doing. We've had words of testimony of, I think, 4 or 5 people getting saved in the last month. Maybe more, maybe like 6 or 7. We've got stories of people's lives that are shared how God got them through this amazingly difficult time in their life to now they're able to worship God about it. And so the idea that we're talking about is creating an environment where we can come, yes, inside the walls of the church, but under the protection of leadership that's been put in place who are trustworthy, people of integrity, people who fear God. That now these are the gatekeepers, these are the guards, these are the assistants who are helping to keep all of this together so that we can then really truly worship God. Where the church is a place of refuge, it's a place of encouragement, it's a place to receive strength. It's a place where we adore who God is because of what God has done. And we're giving testimonies of what God has done and what God is doing. So those of us that are in the midst of I don't know if God can take care of this, can get encouragement because we hear what God's done in other people's lives. And the addition of babies, I'm not sure where that one's hiding, but that should be music to our ears. Because there's another disciple that we have to be able to influence with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And hopefully we have other infants that are part of our church that aren't that size and they don't talk that way, but they're infants in their relationship with Christ because they have just come to Christ. God is taking their lives and transforming them into their image. Verse 70 and 72. I want you to check out this aspect of worship as well. Some of the heads of the families contributed to the work. The governor gave the treasury 1,000 drachmas of gold, 50 bowls, and 530 garments for priests. Some of the heads of the families gave to the treasury for the work 20,000 drachmas of gold and 2,200 minas of silver. The total given by the rest was 20,000 drachmas of gold, 2,000 minas of silver, and 67 garments for the priest. One of the signs of a healthy church is when we are people who give. Now, I'm not just saying giving to the offering. I'm not just saying giving to Operation Christmas Child, but we give of ourselves. We've been so blessed by God's blessing upon us, and I'm not going to sit here and talk a lot about tithing because that's not the purpose of this. It's the heart of giving according to worship, where we give back to God. It's a part of worship. And if we don't understand the whole picture of when it comes to giving to God, then we just think that we're giving God 10% of what is ours. You see, that's backwards. We're really, God is allowing us to keep 90% of what is already His. And when we live in a way of generosity, of worship, and then there's an opportunity to, we were talking about this Wednesday night, that God might call you to do something really weird, but when you do it, you recognize God was all in it, and that you receive a blessing. Sometimes that may mean the gift of your time, which we think we don't have. It might mean the gift of your treasures, which could be a lot of different things. But when we come to it in an attitude of worship, everything changes. When we come together and you hear somebody's need, and God tugs your heart to say, go take care of that. Through an attitude of worship, the dividends on that, or our ROI for you business folks, the return on our investments is out of this world, where we get the glory of God. We see it growing. We see it continuing. So as I conclude this morning, we want you to ask yourselves, in your own personal life, who have you enlisted to be trustworthy support for you, for your family? Who have we enlisted as a church? Who are the gatekeepers in your life? Who are those who are the protectors of your life? Who are the protectors of this church that are keeping us on point as we're even now and continuing to move, not just toward the vision of this church, but the commitment we have to be, it's all about God's word. It's not about our opinions. Who are those people? Are we establishing residency? Now, in that, I'm not talking about church membership. What I am talking about is people feeling that they are part of God's people here. They're part of this community that we call Forest Hills Baptist Church, that they feel wanted, feel a part of that. You know, that as we're establishing residency, that other people are coming to be a part of it through salvation, through, other places where they've been in churches where they just don't fit in or various different things. And God is bringing them to be part of this local body of believers so that they actually feel a part of it. And we're moving forward together. And most importantly, we're doing so as we encourage worship, not just here, but in everything that we do. We're at such a great place as a church, an exciting place. And I know some of you feel like we're stalling in this transitional process. Hopefully you have a little bit better idea of what we're really doing behind the scenes and the time it takes. But please don't hesitate to ask questions about it. But recognize that we are doing things to not just strengthen the walls, but now to make sure we're putting things in place so that we have the protection. We have the ability to be led well into the future. We have people that are in positions to be those protectors, to be the ones that are encouraging worship. We have gatekeepers. We have, we have guards. We have the things established. And remember, as we look for the next leader of this church, as we get closer and closer to that process, what we're doing the whole time, and even now with the bylaws and constitution, even what we're doing now is setting the parameters for what that position looks like and what the qualities and characteristics of that man that will lead into the future. One being, does he have these qualities and characteristics that we're seeing in great leadership? And if he doesn't, what is he doing to supplement that? Those that don't have an answer for that are not the person for leadership of this church. But here's my final question. Who is already here that we need to pour into more, that we need to start giving positions of leadership more so that we can find out who some of these other key positions need to be filled by? Recognize this. God did not design us to try to do it on our own. He designed us to be together in a godly community where we are the body. God didn't create a bunch of organs to try to survive on their own. He created us to be a body who lives together. So as we come to our time of invitation, hopefully the Spirit has spoken to you. Maybe there's some things in your life that you need to pursue somebody else to fill in your life to help you get beyond where you are today. Maybe God is calling you to be part of this church and what's going on here. And we would love to meet with you, hear your testimony, and tell you how you can become a member of this church as we continue to move forward into the future. The walls are rebuilt. And now that's the establishing of great leadership to make sure that those walls do indeed improve the quality of life of the residents there. Who's helping you improve the spiritual quality of your life? Let's stand and sing.